Utilize them. We are beginning our new series today, and it's based off this book. There's still opportunity for you to purchase a book if you want us to purchase one for you, just out on the table in the foyer. You can sign up for one of these, or I think they're $16 for the hardcover book. It is a great book to use for your small group. I would encourage you to do that. One of the things I like really well is when you talk about what we're talking about on Sunday morning in your small groups, because it's kind of like this. So I grew up on a dairy farm, right? And so I'm all about kind of the agricultural scene and things. And if you've ever watched a cow eat, right? Like they just come and they just kind of, their mouth just kind of opens up and they just kind of go and suck it up and then swallow it. And they don't really chew their food, kind of like teenagers, right? You just kind of, it just disappears. You wonder what happened to it. And then later on, they digest it. And cows, they do that too. They suck it all up fast. Then they lay down and they do this, right? Kind of like how I chew gum. And, that's why they say don't chew your gum like a cow, because the cow's chewing its cud, right? So it's basically, it regurgitates the food and it chews on it. It's what we call rumination, okay? And now, you may think, all right, this is gross. Where are you going with this, Pastor Dan? What I'm encouraging you to do is to ruminate, okay? That's the word for the day. Ruminate. So take what we're talking about here. Like if this is the only time that you think about what I'm talking about, you're probably going to get like this much out of the sermon. And this is like valuable time for you. Like the sun is shining. You could be out like working in your lawn. You could be out playing golf. You could be out playing basketball or whatever, which are all cool and fun things to do. But you're here. You're here because there's something important about being here. There's something valuable that happens during this time. But if the only time that you think about what we talk about here is, well, you're sitting in these comfortable seats thinking about other stuff perhaps, you're not going to get much out of it. But if you take this and then you like talk about it a second time with someone else in your small group and you're like, wow, like I got this out of the sermon, and someone else will be like, I didn't hear that, I caught this. And then all of a sudden you've got 2 nuggets instead of 1. Like 2 for the price of one. This is buy one, get one free every Sunday if you're willing to take and talk about it with other people. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But I would encourage you, utilize it, put it into your small groups, and make good out of it. So this series that we're talking about picks up off of the series that we did in the fall about the good and beautiful God. And remember, we started out in that series by talking about how we change and how change happens in our life. And there were 3 steps. Remember the 3 steps? Anybody like, wow, now I'm really pulling like ancient wisdom out of you. It's last fall. So anybody remember any of those 3 steps? Lisa's flipping frantically through her notebook, right? Going back. She's filled up 3 of them since then, so it's like 3 books back. So the first thing is that we have to change our thinking, right? We have to change our thinking. If we all live by narratives, right? We all live by philosophies or ways of thinking, ways that we process information, ways that we understand how the world works, right? And those paradigms or ways that we think and process information, that makes us decide how we're going to live. It influences our decisions. And so we need to change our thinking. We need to move from false narratives, false ways of understanding the world, to correct ways of understanding the world. We're going to be doing some of that during this series as well. We're going to be looking at old narratives that have plagued our lives and challenging them with a new narrative from the Scripture. The second thing we needed to do was to engage new practices, right? We had to, new influencers. I've got it up there for a cheat sheet, so you all could tell me what it is. So I'll put it in the order I've got it on the slides. New influencers, okay? So these are the people that we have around us, right? So if you're a recovering alcoholic and you keep hanging out at the bar, you're going to probably struggle with your alcoholism, right? So if you keep hanging out with people who are reinforcing the old narrative that you're trying to move away from, and you never hang out with people who are giving you a new narrative to live by or reinforcing the new narratives that you want to pattern your life after, you're going to struggle to make that shift in your life. And so you need to hang out with people who are going to be reinforcing the narratives that you want to live by. And I want to challenge you to adopt the narrative of Jesus. to live by that. And so you need to be hanging out with people who would be reinforcing the narrative of Jesus in your life, if that's something you want to live by. And then new practices. So these are the kind of the strategies, right? The new ways of doing things, new disciplines. We could talk about spiritual disciplines, but new practices, new strategies that then help you to live these things out. So this is how we go about making changes. We talked about that last fall. I just want to review that because we're going to be looking at some of those same things in this series here. Now, in the fall, we talked about who God was and how God is good and generous and loving and holy, and we talked about all these attributes of God. This spring, we're going to be talking about the good and beautiful life, the life that Jesus describes as the best thing on earth, right? Jesus says, he says in John 10, I've come that you may have life and that you might have it more abundantly, or you might have it to the full, like max living, right? Living to your fullest potential, we might say. Being all that you can be. You see how like the military institutions like that, they try to steal these things, which really are good biblical principles. Like, be all that you can be is a good biblical principle. That's what Jesus came to do, to help you to do that, to actually not just have that be a slogan, but to be realized in your life, that might become true for you. And so we're going to be looking at the Sermon on the Mount and just thinking about how we can live this good and beautiful life. And as we do that, this morning we're going to actually look at some of the old narratives. We're going to look at Romans chapter 1. And Romans chapter 1 is really a psychological discourse on the state of humanity. Paul writes this long before Freud gets on the scene. But Paul he unpacks the state of humanity in Romans chapter 1. And we're going to be looking at verses 18 down through verse 32. And as we do that, we're going to kind of run into 6 ways to ruin your life without even trying. Okay? So we're going to talk about that. And then at the very end, we're going to just kind of flip over and talk about how Jesus presents something different for us. But we're not going to get into what Jesus presents until next week. So this is kind of a 2-part opener, okay? So this week, we're going to talk about the world's narrative more extensively. Next week, we get into the really good stuff with Jesus' narrative, and we're going to be looking at the Beatitudes. I'm going to tease you now. We're going to be looking at the Beatitudes, and I'm going to show you how the Beatitudes are maybe different than you've ever read them before, and how they can really opened my mind to the Beatitudes when I read them this way. And so I'm excited about that. How many people here want to be happy? Okay, if you didn't raise your hand, there's like 3 of you that are just like, I'm too tired to raise my hand. Yeah, if you didn't want to raise your hand, then you might want to see somebody. You really should talk to somebody soon, okay? We all want to be happy, right? I mean, there was a survey done 2 or 3 years ago where parents people were asked, what was your parents' greatest wish for your life? And they talked about success, they talked about family, they talked about good jobs and things like this. But you know what? 85% of people said that their greatest desire for their kids was that they would be happy. I just want my kids to be happy, right? I mean, you probably have said that. Like, I want my kids to be happy. We all want to be happy. Like, no one goes around like, I shouldn't say no one. There are some people, you probably can think of one person that you know who goes around and they're not happy unless you're miserable because they're miserable, right? Like, they're only happy when everyone around them is miserable because they're a miserable person. No one in this room lives that way. But maybe one of you does. No, I'm just kidding. I wasn't going to mention any names. Okay, Mark? Come on. Yeah, we all want to be happy. We all want to live this life of joy and of excitement, right? And so what is happiness? Is it just an emotional state of well-being? Is it contentment? Is it joy? What is happiness? John Wesley says that you can't be happy without being holy. You can't discover real happiness without holiness. In other words, what Wesley is saying is that apart from God's plan for our lives, happiness will elude us unless we are willing to surrender to the design of our Creator and to embrace his pattern for life, we are going to constantly be frustrated, and happiness will elude us. Happiness emerges from a life that is vectored towards God. It emerges from a life that embraces God's template for living. In the Bible, happiness and goodness go together. There's something unique, right, about biblical happiness. It's the result of an external expression of a life that is oriented towards God and lived according to his definition of what the good life really is. That's what happiness is in the Bible. And so how do we find this? What is the life of happiness, the good life, the well-off life? Well, the world has lots of narratives for us, right? I mean, the world has lots of things, narratives for happiness. Jump back to the slide with all the pictures on it. So, real quick question. If you watch TV, right? How many people watch TV? Right? Now, if you didn't raise your hand, I know you're lying today. Because like everybody watches TV, right? Although I do have to be careful. I was in a seminary, one of my seminary professors, they did not own a TV on purpose because they thought it was too much of a brain drain for them. So, but I watch TV. We like to watch some of the, we're watching The Voice and some shows like that. I like to watch Discovery Channel and learn things, and then I watch Swamp People too. But I don't think I learned anything there. But I enjoy watching them catch the alligators, right? So, but during your show, there's a ton of commercials that come on, right? And the commercials are all selling happiness, aren't they? Right? Like really what they're trying to sell you is like, if you buy this product, you will be happy. And if you don't have this product, you are miserable. Right? I mean, some commercials come right out and say it like the Lipton tea, right? You can't buy happiness, but you can buy tea, which is basically the same. Right? Or Coca-Cola, right? Coke has been, open up a can of happiness, right? I mean, that was their big commercial during the Super Bowl a few years back. Car commercials, right? Like you see all the people, like they're sad and then they get a new car and then they're like, life is grand. I love my Adidas make me happy. My sneakers, right? Like if you're not wearing the right sneaker, your life is miserable. You may not be aware of this, but if you don't own Adidas sneakers, you really are not happy. No, I'm serious. You are not happy until you put a pair of Adidas on, right? I mean, that's the message that we're inundated with every time a commercial comes on, whether it's selling Cialis or whether it's selling sneakers, right? I mean, they're all selling, this will make you happy. This is what you need in order to live a fulfilled life, right? So these are the narratives that the world gives us. These are the narratives that the world says, if you buy stuff, if you own stuff, if you do the right things, you will be happy, right? So these are narratives that the world might say. The one with the most toys wins, right? That's the more you have, the happier you will be. You only go around once, so take all that you can. All's fair in love and war. These are narratives that the world I think puts out there. Rules are made to be broken. Don't be confined by your commitments. Do whatever feels good. Just do it. Right? Whatever you want to do, whatever you feel like, that's what's going to make you happy. So go do it. Go at it. Whatever. No rules, right? No boundaries. Just go at it. I mean, happiness comes from sex, from power, from money, from all these things that the world puts out there and says, these are the ways to find happiness. And you know what? You can find some temporary happiness in those things, right? You can. Otherwise, if nobody found some temporary happiness at all in those things, they would quit looking at them and they'd quit running after them. But even we can find some temporary happiness in some of these things, right? Like, when we bought my truck, it made me feel happy. We bought our new lawnmower, and it's like a John Deere mower. I'm a John Deere guy. And so I'm like, whoa, and I have to show it off to everybody. It makes me happy. And you buy a new car, right? Like some of you have bought new cars, and you put it on Facebook, and you have all these things, and you're like, whoa, man, look at my new car, right? And you like, no one can eat it in the car for like 2 years, until it loses the new car smell. Like you don't even let your kids ride in it, It's like, no, you have to ride in the old car. I'm driving the new car by myself, right? And you're so happy, and it's like, you drive into work with that thing. It's all, like it's shined up nice. You kind of, the guy driving the old beater pulls up in and you kind of step out and you're like, it's nothing. Yeah, you're like, look at that, look at that new car. We all experience some temporary happiness in these things, but it doesn't give us long-term happiness, does it? All these things are fleeting, they're temporary, they're just for a little while. And it's bound to be that way because these are all false narratives. They're all false narratives to true happiness. They're made up, fake. And so let's take a look at why they're false narratives as we turn to Romans chapter 1. And we're going to go fairly quickly through this. But Romans chapter 1, we're going to start at verse 18 and read down through verse 32. So Paul writing here says this, "But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything that God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God." What's Paul saying? Let's stop right there. What's Paul saying? He's saying that even an idiot, I shouldn't use that language, should I? He's saying that anybody, even your spouse, can recognize God's presence in the world. Right? Like there is no excuse. Everybody can see God's presence in the world if you just look around. Right? I mean, like you woke up this morning and it was all frosty out there and the sun was shining on it, and Abby and I were driving in the truck, and I had left the truck out, so I had to scrape the ice off it this morning, and we're driving up the road and Abby goes, "It looks like glitter." And I'm like, "You're right, it does. It was beautiful." Everything's sparkling in the sun for like 30 seconds before it melted off, right? And you can just see God's handiwork. You can see his presence. You can see his power, his creativity right there. Paul's saying, listen, everybody can see that there's a God who made this, that there's something bigger than just us, that it's not just happenstance. It's ordered. It's intelligent. It's created. Verse 21, "Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused." So I'm gonna work this different today than keep up the scripture PowerPoint for people, but I'm gonna kind of jump through some of the notes too. So if you're taking notes and you want the PowerPoint stuff, email me and I'll email you the whole PowerPoint because you might miss some of the slides later on. But here's the first thing, right? So everybody can see that there's a God. Everybody that's using their brain, you have to recognize that there's something out there that's created this grandiose world that we live in. But first step to ruin your life without even trying, refuse to acknowledge there's a God. Cut God out of your life. There is no God. God is dead. God has left the building. Right? That's the first step here. Verse 21. They knew God. They recognized, because everybody can recognize that there's a God out there. They realized that there was a God, but they didn't want God. So they threw him out like last night's leftovers. In the trash. Down the drain. Out to the garbage heap with God. They wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. So the first step is to turn away from God. I want to be God. I want to be the one in charge, right? Adam and Eve did the same thing, didn't they? They're there in the garden, everything's beautiful. They knew God. Like God came over for dinner last night. And they had this great time with God at dinner. And then the next day at noon, they're sitting there talking with the serpent, and the serpent says, well, you really don't want God like calling the shots all the time, do you? You want to know what God knows? You want to have the power that God has? Then push God out of your life. You become God. You become God. You don't need God because you can know everything that he knows and you can do everything that he does. So do away with God and you become God. First step to ruin your life, you become God. Refuse to give God his place in your life. Let's keep reading. Claiming to be wise, they instead became, this is verse 22, claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So step 2, false reality clouds our thinking. So the first thing we do is we get rid of God, and then we begin to rationalize why it's okay to get rid of God. Okay? So we've dumped God like an old girlfriend, right? So we've dumped him, and I guess it'd be an old boyfriend with God. So you dump God like an old boyfriend, and now you've got to like feel good about, like you feel lousy like after a breakup, you're like, life is all, I'm so bummed out, And so you begin thinking, that guy was a jerk. Like he never called me, he didn't care about my feelings. He never wrote me fancy poems like Bobby. He didn't have, he wasn't as good looking, and you begin to rationalize why it was good to dump that guy, right? So false thinking clouds our reality. So God, he really didn't care about me. He never showed up and did whatever. He never bought me a new Mercedes. He didn't, last night, he didn't bring me enough, whatever. He didn't answer this prayer. He let that happen in my life. He doesn't care about me. And we begin to make up things about why it's okay to not have God in our lives. So false thinking clouds their reality. And then step 3, what happens? Step 3 is their clouded thinking, they replace God with something else. So here's the reality. We are made with a God hole in our lives. Like we're made to want to know our Creator. We're made to seek out after something bigger than ourselves. All of us do that. We all want something more than just what we have in our own selves. And so God fills that hole, but if we dump God, we got to have somebody else or something else fill that hole. And so what happened here, right? So foolish ideas clouded their mind. Their minds became dark and confused, verse 21. Verse 22, claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. Verse 23, and instead of worshiping the glorious ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people, birds, and animals, and reptiles. So they made substitutes for God. So we dump God, we rationalize why it's good to dump God, and then we create God substitutes because we realize, we need something to fill that spot in our lives. So what are you filling that spot with? If it's not God, what is it? Is it money? A lot of people, it's money. In the American society, money. Money, 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 right? Like, show me the money. Show me, Jerry Maguire, show me the money, right? It's power for some people. I just want to be the boss. I just need to get to the top, right? It doesn't matter who I step on to get there. It doesn't matter what it costs me. If it costs me my family, I'm going to get to the top. I'm going to work like a bazillion hours every week. I'm going to disregard everybody that's in my life because I'm going to get to the top. I'm going to get that promotion no matter what it takes. I'm going to be the boss of this company someday. It's about power. Maybe it's just about physical pleasure. And so you're out there running around, casual sex, drugs, getting the buzz from alcohol, whatever it is, whatever that physical high is, that immediate physical high, that releases those endorphins. And that becomes the thing that you run after and you want and you pursue with all that you have. And it doesn't matter what it takes or what gets in the way or how it harms people around you or even your own body. You're after that physical pleasure. That's become your new God. You've replaced God's spot with that. If God's not in that spot, what is? Something is. That spot will not remain empty. It's like a vacuum, right? Something's going to fill that spot. If it's not God, what is it in your life? Step 4, verse 24. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. God lets you do what you want to do. You kick God to the curb. You rationalize why that's okay. You fill it with a substitute, and God says, okay. Go ahead. See where it gets you. God lets you fill his spot with something else. Left alone by God, we dive deeper into sin, seeking pleasure at all cost. As a result, picking up verse 24, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. They traded the truth about God for a lie. That was step 1 and 2. So they worshiped and served the things God created, step 3, instead of the Creator himself, who was worthy of eternal praise. And that is why God abandoned them, step 4, to their shameful desires, verse 26. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex, and instead indulged in sex with each other. And the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burned with lust for each other. And men did shameful things with other men, and as a result of this sin, they suffered within themselves the penalty they deserved, since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, verse 28. He abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Left alone, God lets us pursue our own desires. And without God's pattern of goodness, our own desires twist us into weird shapes and contours that begin to turn in against ourselves. And we're going around the toilet, around and around and down and down. Life spiraling out of control. Some of you have lived this, haven't you? Some of you who know God now and God has filled that spot, there was a time in your life where God didn't fill that spot and you abandoned God, you rejected him, you turned away from him. You rationalized that. And then you began to set out and you pursued other things. And some of you have stories about where those other things took you. And about how they almost destroyed you. Left alone by God, we dive deeper into sin, seeking pleasure at all cost. Which brings us to verse 28. Since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Verse 29. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning and they disobey their parents. That's not a new way. That's an old way. They refuse to understand. They break their promises. They are heartless and have no mercy. They know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die, yet they do them anyways. Worse yet, they encourage others to do them too. Seeking pleasure at all cost makes sin our ruler. And so we're sucked into this this downward spiral where what we did last time is like drugs, right? Like you need more and more in order to get the same high. And the same thing happens with sin. You got to go deeper and deeper in order to feel the same excitement. Sin becomes our ruler. That's the narrative of the world. You don't need God, so give God the boot. Here's why you don't need God, because we're all smart and intelligent and too smart for God. So give God the boot and fill God with something else, power, money, pleasure. Do it, just do it. Well, guess where that's going to land you? At the end of the day, it lands you with sin as your ruler, empty, broken, destroyed. Not a very happy picture, but I think it's an accurate picture. So here's the question. How much of that narrative is true for you right now? Is that narrative connecting with you? Like, is that the one that you're pursuing? Is that the one that you've bought into? And maybe this morning it's the first time you've heard the other side of the story. Like, in the advertisements, they don't tell you all the, things that when you get to the salesman, the salesperson says, oh, well, the new car includes this, 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 and this, and you got to pay this, this, and this, and this, and, if you leave us your first child, we'll give you the car, right? But it's all glitz and glamour and fun and exciting, and then suddenly it's like, wow, there literally is hell to pay at the end. That's the end of the narrative. That's where the world's narrative leads us. And if that's the narrative you're following, that's the destination. But there's an alternative narrative to live by. You don't have to live by the world's narrative. There is an alternative. We're going to be looking at the Sermon on the Mount over the next several weeks, and at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives this illustration. He says, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rains came a-tumbling down. The rains came down, and the floods came, whoop. The rains came down, and the floods came, whoop. The rains came down, and the floods came, whoop. And the house on the sand fell flat. But the wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the same rains came tumbling down. And the rains came down, and the floods came, whoop. The rains came down, and the floods came, whoop. The rains came down, and the floods came, whoop. But the house on the rock stood firm. There's another narrative you can live by. The narrative of Jesus. A narrative that ends in something different. That ends in a good and beautiful life. Not a life that ends up in the toilet, out of control, hell to pay. A life that is good and beautiful and filled with grace and love, with heaven as its final destination. That's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to begin to talk about what does that look like? What is that narrative? And then what does that narrative look like? And if that's a narrative you want to live by, then don't let today be the only day that you're here. But join me as we look into this narrative of Jesus about the good and beautiful life. Let's pray.